Morning. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce the program and stuff. John told me to remind the class, however, before I begin, that this class is not meeting next Sunday. So if you come over here, something else will be happening here, or nothing will be happening here, or something. But it won't be this. So don't come to this class next Sunday. It doesn't exist next Sunday, right? Look, I'm happy to do the introduction this morning. Tony Abbott, who died in October of 2020, was the Charles A. Donna Professor of English at Davidson College, where he taught from 1964 to 2001. At his passing, the college president noted that he was abundantly creative, a generous teacher with a kind and gentle heart. This congregation in particular experienced these qualities in special measure. Tony was a longtime member here, and with this lecture we remember him, the teacher, poet, and friend who was for so many years the driving force of this covenant class. This morning it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and the distinguished scholar, Karl, who will deliver today's lecture. Karl is the J.W. Cannon Professor of Religious Studies at Davidson, where he has taught since 1982. He teaches in the area of biblical studies, Jewish literature and thought, and religion and literature. Karl is widely published and also an active musician. Among other things, he is a fiddler for the Celtic group Under the Tree. So if you're not careful, he may break out with a fiddle here. He is himself a published poet, as Tony also was. Around Chambers Building, right over here, where he and I have adjacent offices on the second floor, Karl is well known for his precise attention to texts, really for relishing each word, and for his meticulous guidance of students. He is also known as a fine conversation partner and for his superb collection of minor league baseball caps, which he occasionally wears to class. Go Mudhens, go Crawdads, go Tourists, go Shorebirds, and about 12 others that I think Karl must have at least. The title of his lecture this morning is, But What About the Joy? Karl, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Doug. I'm not going to break out the fiddle this morning. You're safe on that that score. Should have brought a ball cap, though. That would have been good fun. Wow, it's so great to see so many faces that are dear to me. It's been a long time. And I want to give special greetings to Susan Abbott this morning. Thank you all for this welcome. And the opportunity to speak to you this morning in memory of Tony. I'm simultaneously humbled and honored to speak to you in memory of Tony Abbott. Tony was my friend and a North Star when it came to guiding my development as a teacher and writer, and perhaps more as a person. I am not the only one for whom this was true. And so I say in all seriousness, we miss him. I begin with a remembrance that I have shared on more than one occasion, especially in the time right after his death. Forgive me if I repeat, but this will take me where I need to go. Over the years, Tony sat in on several of my courses in the religion department at Davidson. The first, sometime in the 1980s, was a course on Jewish and Christian parable literature. On the day we studied Jesus' treasure parable, I found myself emphasizing the radical paradox at the heart of this one-sentence narrative, that the man who would claim this treasure hidden in the field must give up everything, that finding and losing are tangled together in a deep way that this storyteller knew and felt was at the heart of the kingdom of heaven. Everything could mean just that, all that we have, an emptying of self that goes beyond the coins in our bag to include status, security, the way we see ourselves in the world, all those things we hold in hand just in case. It is a necessary component of the parable, and I hit it hard, speaking of the parable as no less than a self-consuming artifact that finally calls one to give up also the authority of the story. I have no doubt that I did this for nearly the whole 50 minutes of class. And as the session was winding down, students were already gathering their things, Tony's voice rang out from the back row. "But what about the joy, Karl? What about the joy?" And then he grinned, the same grin you would remember, as if he were the man in the parable that had just found treasure, a treasure which, though tangled with giving up, required an emptying made in great joy, so much so that one might say that this joy was the treasure itself. To borrow from the American writer John Barth, the key to the treasure is the treasure, and for Tony, that treasure key was joy. The parable says explicitly that the man who finds the treasure gives up everything in great joy in order to have it. I was struck then, as I still am, at how easily I had eluded joy from the story, something that may reveal more than I need presently to explore about my own proclivities at the time. I felt challenged to learn something about myself in this exchange and what Tony had revealed about himself. That joy was not only a possibility for the worst of us, walking around in sandy fields we thought empty, but also the vital necessity. Tony had just testified. It is but a short step from Tony's question to the Apostle Paul's insistence in the Philippians letter, a letter written from prison, that we should rejoice in the Lord always. That's a clear enough imperative. Curious then that Paul adds to it immediately, "I will say it again, rejoice." Why does he have to repeat it? He himself may have created the obstacle with his cross-intoxicated proclamation, but he may also be recognizing the difficulty in what he's commanding them to do. As Paul's Christ hymn in this letter presents a model of kenosis, or emptying, so must the joyful empty themselves of something easily hoarded. He adds to the list of imperatives, don't be anxious about anything. Give it up, he seems to say, even if this seems to mean everything, and too often it does. Perhaps the apostle's oddest and yet true follower becomes Franz Kafka, whose policeman replies similarly when asked for direction. Give it up, he says, accompanying his words with laughter. Or let's go to the precursor of Tony's angel dialogues, the angels in the Gospel of Luke. These are the messengers that scare the wits out of shepherds abiding in their fields, only to voice, "Be not afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of a great joy, which will come to all the people, for to you is born this day." Such scriptures put joy at odds with a life ordered by anxiety and fear, and perhaps then lay their finger on what we find so challenging about joy, if not, in fact, miraculous. Somewhere a reader of Paul's letter is saying, I don't think we can do this. The gravity of deeply entrenched misery that never seems to let up makes Paul seem mad in his request. We can no more rejoice always than we can jump up in the air and stay aloft. And wouldn't it seem morally insensitive to do so in the presence of suffering others? I don't think we can do this, but what if joy is not something that we do, but something we find ourselves in or experience when we stop doing all those other things that impede its presence. Closer to the bone, I think, is not the question of the possibility of joy's coming as gift, but our desire for it. Do we want it, or is it too costly? Well, who wouldn't want it? In a world in which we suffer and die from a lack of joy, I would suggest, though, that there is something in us that resists it, nevertheless. All of us. I'm not sure we want joy, not enough to give up everything for it. But what if that's the only way we can have it? In these scriptures, joy manifests an interruptive force in human life. The man in the field faces the interruption of the saved-up-for future as he empties his bank account. Paul's audience, if anxious, must contend with the interruption of the nightly monkey-mindedness that spins out of control and haunts the worst that imaginations can conjure. The shepherds in the field encounter the interruption of empire that dominates and keeps them stuck in a plot not of their own making, an interruption that comes with a birth and thereby a promise that a new beginning is even now making itself available. Surely such interruptions are good news, that you need not secure the future for yourself, that the anxious voices have no lasting power, that one is not stuck in whatever story oppresses or depresses. Good news, except for the way we grow fond of these familiar realities, sometimes manipulating them for our advantage, finding in them a controllable predictability that for all the misery they cause may yet seem preferable to a joy that surprises, that is beyond our power to create of our own accord, and claims us for a freedom that we cannot shrug off with even the genuine protests of fear or desire to be in solidarity with those who have no joy. Easier to roll the eyes with irony at the prospect of joy. Thus Paul repeats it. Again, I say, rejoice. The resistance to joy seems knee-jerked. I would wager big money that none of us doubt another's confession of suffering. But to the report of joy, most of us instinctively whisper, yeah, I bet. Or, we'll see how long this lasts. We are wary of joy as we are wary of good news that asks something of us. On the one hand, we may resent the joy of others when it seems remote from our lives, or out of ethical sobriety, put it aside when it would seem insensitive to the misery that roves about too obviously. That last habit does have merit, but is dangerous in the way it disguises our underlying fear. If joy comes our way, we will need to give up our default position of complaint with which we evade the possibility not only of joy, but responsibility and the freedom of being basically all right. Paul and the angels were correct. Joy bumps up against anxiety and fear and sets them in flight. And at the same time, it is the giving up of anxiety and fear that opens one's life to joy. I doubt we can easily do that, but joy might happen to us anyway. Like the way salvation arrives and interrupts all else, even the buried conviction that we'd rather die than live in such a full, free way. Here's how it might happen. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, shelf-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this desire, delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable, sweetness raveling rot. It is now, it is not. The poem is Osip Mandelstam's, as translated by Christian Wyman. Mandelstam, perhaps the most significant of early 20th century Russian poets, might seem an unlikely candidate for joy, though having already put Paul and Kafka on the list, I won't turn back now. No stranger to imprisonment, torture, and exile, he had famously satirized Stalin in one poem and paid for it. Mandelstam wrote in the context of Stalin's purges and was, as they said, disappeared in the gulag of Soviet work camps where he died in 1938. Yet even here, a moment of joy interrupts that deathly narrative with astonishing surprise. And I was alive in the blizzard of blossoming pear. He does not act as much as he is present to what is happening. Myself, I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. Standing there, though, is no small thing in the way it counters fearful inclinations to run from the surprising. Standing there, if not everything, is the first step on the surprise to joy, on the path to joy. Standing there takes courage, for as Mandelstam describes it, being present to this stormy blizzard of beauty is self-shattering. At the same time, I imagine he has little choice, tractor beamed to a power that is aimed all at him and made him feel not dead, but so unimaginably alive. Standing there, he is not the agent of this epiphany, but the one who has opened himself up to receiving the self-shattering gift of all being aimed at him and the vitality it has brought forth. These, I believe, are the cardinal features of joy, the ways it comes as a gift or surprise, and the ways it makes one intensely alive. Mandelstam's language invokes a harsh setting, storms and blizzards, something targeting him. Yet the tempestuousness has no icy chill, but brings the overwhelm of grace and beauty, of spring, not winter. If he is targeted, it is by the bounty of these same realities that are being brought to him as if aimed. They are not only at him, but for him, as he experiences the giving, the gift of the deep sense of being alive in the domain veering otherwise toward death. The experience defies explanation, as his questions indicate. Moreover, explanation would be beside the point and at odds with the fullness of this mystery that reaches beyond. We don't want Mandelstam to explain. We want him to live, to continue to stand there. And we fear rightly that if he were to start explaining, that this would mean the end of any leaf life and star shower. Still, if he cannot account for the gift, he can name it, and in doing so, humbly bow before it, or even sound its praise. Time intensified and time intolerable, sweetness raveling rot, it is now, it is not. His joy is the gift of standing amid time made full, fulfilled to the point and beyond which it can be borne, a glad dying, we might say, to the limits of the mere. This is a reckoning of time in which he surrenders joyfully, a moment which is fully present and yet eternal, now and not. The discovery of a sweetness that ravels rot. If we let Mandelstam's poem furnish a model of joy, it becomes apparent that joy and happiness are not the same. Joy has a profundity, and with Mandelstam, a self-shattering that go beyond the niceties of happiness. A moment of joy might change one forever, might feed one, might save one. In contrast, happiness is pleasant. A trinket, but not especially weighty treasure. I wouldn't give up everything for it, but I might for joy. Said another way, as the angels knew, joy gives birth to something novel, something interruptive that takes one into uncharted territory, into unchartable experience. Joy has no map. As we stand there, like Mandelstam, it transports us to a wilderness that is also our true home. Thus Liesl Müller, a refugee from Nazi Germany as a teenager, Müller settled with her family in the American Midwest, ultimately winning the National Book Award, and in 1996, the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her poem, Joy, evokes joy's power, complexity, and destination. Don't cry, it's only music, someone's voice is saying. No one you love is dying. It's only music, and it was only spring. The world's unreasoning body run amok like a saint's with glory that overwhelmed a young girl into unreasoning sadness. Crazy, she told herself. I should be dancing with happiness. But it happened again. It happens when we make bottomless love. There follows a bottomless sadness, which is not despair, but its nameless opposite. It has nothing to do with the passing of time. It's not about loss. It's about two seemingly parallel lines, suddenly coming together inside us in some place that is still wilderness. Joy, joy, the sopranos sing, reaching for the shimmering notes while our eyes fill with tears. The voice in Müller's poem expects happiness to be dancing with it, in fact. But this itself is a source of frustration. Instead, she confronts something less expected and more complex, joy. Joy is occasioned, I would surmise, by sopranos soaring in the high notes of Beethoven's Ninth, the ecstatic repetition of Freude, Freude, an ode to joy that takes out the wall between chorus and audience. And here she is crying as if someone she loved was dying, even though no one is. Tears of joy, we sometimes say, as if to contrast them with tears of pain or sadness, tears which we more readily understand or at least are familiar with. Yet Müller's poem asks us to hold these together as an expression that overflows from the bottomless well where we know the outpouring of both love and sadness at once. It's not about loss, she says, reminding us that this is not the same thing as poignance or glimpse of the precious, though these two may make us tear up. It has nothing to do with the passing of time, she says, forbidding us to tie these tears to the mortality of love, flowers that fade and grass that withers, Margaret in her grove unleaving and all of that. What then are these tears? Tears come forth when the walls that hold them back give way. Along with Mandelstam, Müller witnesses joy as a self-shattering, a breaking of the self's armor that lets into our being all and everything, the power of music, of spring, of the world's unreasoning body run amok, the overwhelm, the God-glorying dam burst of dappled things, to invoke Hopkins' language, the praise-forthing of pied beauty in its liberation of all things counter, original, spare, strange. Mueller's joy tears signify a self that has escaped its leash and roams toward the place that is still wilderness. For the joyful self is wild, embracing a bewilderment whose earmarks are not confusion, but clear recognition that, as she said, the parallel lines have suddenly come together inside us. And no longer can we be so sure that giving up everything and discovering treasure are not one and the same. It's not about loss, she says, except in the way, perhaps, that the lost become found. The way the thing you lost and thought you'd never find again is always yourself. Tony's revered Frederick Buechner said this was what the kingdom of God was like, and it sounds exactly the right chord. Joy insists not only that we love as if that kingdom of God had come, but that we do so with reckless abandon. This joy is not the opposite of sadness, but here the contrary of a tamed self, bound and limited by its own fear of the possible impossibility. The joyful self is wild and ever heads for a wilderness without emotional walls to hold back tears, that heads for wilderness as if for a homecoming, a recovery not of innocence or happiness, but of possibility. For in Rebecca Solnit's words, there is a place where sadness and joy are not distinct, where all emotion lies together, a sort of ocean into which the tributary streams of distinct emotions go, afar away, deep inside. Here the boundaries are not so rigidly drawn, nor the options constrained in advance by the anxious-ridden rules of necessity. A place where one might, a la Wicked's Elphaba, defy gravity. In this way, Mueller suggests joy is not so much an emotion or a single affect, but the liberation of the self for all emotions and the experiences from which they spring. To live and love wildly. Joy is jailbreak, an exodus into the wilderness where we become free for tears and sweetness raveling rot. Mandelstam's manna that keeps him alive. If joy is the answer, perhaps the question is, how do we stay alive? Or better, why? For Lucille Clifton, the doyen of 20th century African American poetry, why is a question that earns a line all its own. Thus her poem, Hag Riding. Why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the Afrikaan in me still trying to get home after all these years. But when I wake to the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, something hopeful rises in me, rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high over the rump of the day, and honey, I ride, I ride. There alone on the initial line of the poem, why signifies without clear specificity, as if it were the fundamental or underlying question to all else, so basic that it need not be spelled out. If she indicates no reference, her suggestion that maybe it is the Afrikaan in me still trying to get home after all these years, hints at one path we might take. Why is the question you raise far from home after years of trying to get back? If she is still trying to get back, then it is clear as well that she has not been able to complete her return, and it has been a long time. Why? An exile's question, we would have to say, striking at the core of what it means to be cut off from whatever precious taproot home conveys, or simply of the estrangement of no longer being at home with ourselves. Why have we been brought to this spot in the road where things seem alien, heavy, and stale? And where do we go from here? How do we persist? Clifton's why doesn't find a direct answer. Instead, her poem offers something like testimony, the witness of what happens nevertheless. So much depends on that adversative conjunction, but. We have the years of trying, seemingly to no end, and then we have something else. But then this. Something else notwithstanding. Something regardless of the gravities that would nail her to her place in barren fields of alien corn. The years of trying, but then the heat of the morning arrives. No, more vividly, the morning comes galloping at her, and she wakes to it. You can almost hear her channel Mandelstam and say, "And I was alive in the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, and it was all aimed at me." This heat, whose energy stirs her like horse hooves racing, is not her own making, any more than Mandelstam manufactures his leaf shower. She wakes to a reality that aims at her and counters the downpress of gravity with something hopeful rising. If Mandelstam stood struck, Clifton finds herself running to the road, running not from, but toward, and with the momentum that will carry her away and forward and beyond to a destination neither disclosed nor as significant as the wild motion itself. Carried away with the reckless abandon of joy, we might put it just this way. She does consent in a vivid way to continue the day's forward motion. Unforgettably, she lobs her fierce thigh high over the rump of day. Here the reckless abandon, and rides. She persists into the nevertheless of day, joining the girth of her body to day's own, becoming one with its motion. But we must go back exactly to how she puts it. Honey, I ride, I ride. The utterance, honey, is nearly everything, and is again sweetness raveling the rot. The colloquial vocative conveys affection for the hearer, but even more announces that what words follow are worth hearing, and you better believe it. That what she's going to say can only be spoken with enthusiasm in the unbridled joy of the revelation. I ride, I ride. She might have stopped the poem with, honey, and I believe that pronounced in the way I hear her voice, it would have satisfied. But she asks us to consider this final image of her writing. Said twice, it is a figure of determination and insistence. It affirms what she is doing and will continue to do, even as it recognizes the gift of its possibility. She will not deny nor be denied her day. To where does she ride? It may not make a difference to the one carried away in the vitality of heat and gallop. Yet we might also envision her riding in the direction of a home once lost and now in the process of being found. "Honey," I hear her to say, "let me tell you where the treasure lies buried." Who could resist? Who could not take this as an invitation to joy, to ride toward that place where we are most fully at home? In March 1990, Lucille Clifton read at Davidson. She read from her collection Two-Headed Woman in the old 900 room, now the well-appointed auditorium of the Sloan Music Building, but back then a dark, long, low-lit space with a stage best suited for folk music performances, which were common enough on the weekends. In that venue, she could do casual, which is to say, she had a natural ease when she read. She didn't stand on pretense and related to everyone in a personal way as if she were at a church picnic. At the same time, she stood before us with remarkable dignity and bearing, reading brief, short-line poems in a manner that let every word claim its due. Poetry is like that, of course, and short poems even more so. Thus, I should not have been surprised when I took up my copy of Two-Headed Woman for her to sign, and she inscribed it with a one-word poem. "To Karl," she wrote, "joy," and then signed her name. Joy, exclamation point. Can it be punctuated in any other way? Actually, that's a real question. Without the exclamation point, do we not encounter something less than joy? Do we not need the exclamation point in the same way we need Clifton's luxuriant honey to remind us that when it comes to joy, much depends on how we say it? That is, does not joy finally issue in a poetry that is known by its way of speaking more than from what is said? Joy is the fearless abandon that puts the exclamation in whatever we give ourselves to say. The volume and tone in the sound of honey, and the resonance in the music that brings forth tears. Her inscription, in my eyes, would not have been any poorer had she only drawn a vertical line with a bouncy dot beneath it, a gesture of dash and verve. But she wrote what she wrote, and now I ponder it seriously. Joy, exclamation point. As a one-word poem in Two-Headed Woman, it testifies to her experience that joy is indeed a possibility, and that she certifies its reality with the signing of her name. Actually, I almost read singing her name, and that would have worked too. More, as the sole word she writes in the inscription, she reminds me that joy is not only possible, but vital. That apart from this, there will not be anything else worth saying, no treasure to find. And more still, her word of witness sounds as an apostolic imperative. Rejoice always, exclamation point. Again, I say, rejoice. We do not have the power to make it happen, but we ever have the power to let joy come forth, to stand before it with awe, to cry shamelessly in its presence, or simply to get on its back and ride. And now I hear from the back of the room the echo of my friend asking, "But Karl, what about the joy?" I hope these comments today might be the start of an answer to his question, or at least a sign that I have heard what he asked and have been listening to it over the years. Tony Abbott would have tolerated a lecture on the subjects such as this one. He was always kind in that regard. But at the end of class, perhaps the answer he sought was more along the lines of Clifton's one-word poem in my book. Without denying anything I had said about the parable's radical surrendering, could I also say, as he could, joy, and add the exclamation point? Could I add the exclamation point and the grin that showed how deeply he understood and embraced that reality in which we come to know our greatest treasure? Shield the joyous, an Episcopal collect offers, surprisingly, along with intercession for the weary, the afflicted, and the dying. This we pray, for joy is precious and rare, fragile, yet abiding in the memory of those whose hearts uttered forth with courage, "And I was alive." Those who kept before us the undeniable possibility. Those who insist, but what about the joy? Shield them, Lord Christ. Thank you.
Would you take any questions?
I would.
Anyone?
Yeah, this is just like class.
I just finished Alice Hoffman's book, The World We Knew, about the Jewish, during the Holocaust. And in there's a golem who finds love at the end. How would you relate joy to love? Because to her, it seems love is everything.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I've been trying to do is take this out of too much of a semantic kind of definition, and I think I would do something similar for love. What if these were verbs more than nouns, the way we do something more than what it is that we do? If I go with that and couple it to what I think she means by love, love requires that you make yourself available to the one that you love, not partially, not shielded, not armored, but in an open, vital, even wild way. And in that sense, doing the work of joy or being open to joy becomes kind of a precondition to the fulfillment of joy in a life of love. That joy is what it is that opens the self beyond the borders of defensiveness or fragmentation, and sort of, what do you give in love? If one is going to give oneself, that self somehow has to be able to come forth. And I think joy is that coming forth, and would have to be in whatever circumstance one finds oneself. So, the work you've been talking about belongs in the same, on the same shelf, say, as Mandelstam's poem. Mandelstam wrote that poem perhaps on his last day alive, for what we know. Yet he's saying, "And here I am, awake, alive." So again, it's not contradicted by the harsh, severe gravities of circumstance, but rather is this who I am that is available in the coming forth. I think joy then would be that precondition for love, and love would be the fulfillment of joy, something that keeps it from being other than self-intoxicating or simply an emotion that makes me happy. I mean, joy has work to do. Joy, I think, creates a momentum toward others, and so I would connect them in that way. Thanks for that question. That's a good one.
Go, John.
Karl, I'm a hymn book junkie, and we have a hymn in our relatively new hymn book entitled "Joyful is the Dark." It's contemporary, 1980s. Let me read the first stanza and just let you pick up on that if you can. Joyful is the dark, holy hidden God, rolling cloud of night beyond all naming, majesty in darkness, energy of love, word in flesh, the mystery proclaiming. It rhymes. What does it mean?
I love that connection of joy in dark. I think often we have too limited the experience of something like joy to spring, sunshiny day. And that is joyful enough. And it's interesting to me that Mandelstam, for instance, finally uses spring imagery to get to it. That's understandable, but he also talks about it in terms of a blizzard. It could easily have gone icy. I think if one can't go into the dark, and I'm thinking of Barbara Brown Taylor's book, whose name I'm not going to be able to think of. It's Learning to Walk in the Dark, something like that. If the darkness is someplace on your map that you don't go or don't want to go or can't go or go only with fear and anxiety, then it limits also the joy you may know. The task of joy would be to carry it wherever one is or to know it wherever one is, and thus having a spot on the map that says don't go there, like we usually think of dark, or you better go and take your flashlight, that would be problematic. I think the hymn that you're pointing to is pushing joy beyond its ordinary bounds, and also surprisingly, I should say, opening oneself up to what one might find when one goes off the map, when one goes into the dark, that one may feel a kind of unchartedness. One may experience mysteriousness. One may see the stars a whole lot brighter. I mean, any of those kinds of things. But the dark has its own mystery and its own, in that sense, its own joy. What Mandelstam and Mueller and Clifton are talking about, I think, is not something that's a day emotion. And that the dark is not only a place where one could take joy, but the darkness is something which could feed joy. That image of Mueller that she has of the parallel lines eventually converging at once is so strong. We think of day and night, light and dark, in terms of their antipathy, but at the depth from which joy arrives, perhaps the parallel lines converge. And one experiences there is this common mystery that I am alive in the midst of it all. And to settle for some one domain would be to settle for a life that is more cloistered and less full. I love that hymn. I'm going to have to look that one up.
Other questions? Well, again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well. Just one more thing. That story about Tony in the parables class actually has become something of a legend now. I mean, not in the sense of not being true, but that it's got its own afterlife. I've told that in class enough that now every student that's had that course, and I first taught that course in 1984, so I've taught it a lot. They know it. I had a student come back the other day, and we were talking about that course. And, did you tell him about the time that professor asked you about the joy? I sure did. So she's, some 50 years old and remembers that. It was a good thing for her to have remembered. It is so good to be with you all and to see you and to think of Tony in this place. I do hope you're well. Be well. Absolutely. Well, they're for the ear, for sure. Thanks so much, Susan. Good to see you. Thanks, Sterling. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we all should have. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks, Louis. You too. Give her a hug for me.